On behalf of Cambridge Innovation Institute's Global Web Symposia Series and our sponsor, Unchained Labs, I'd like to welcome you to see which proteins like it hot with new isothermal apps on UNCLE. My name is Elizabeth Lamb, and I'm the host and moderator for today's event. Now I would like to introduce our presenter. He is Andre Mueller, PhD, Product Manager, UNCLE, with Unchained Labs. Welcome, Dr. Mueller. The webinar is yours.
All right. Thank you very much for this introduction, and thank you all for joining me this morning for my presentation that I titled, See Which Proteins Like It Hot with the New Isothermal Applications in UNCLE. When you're working with proteins and you want to test proteins for their stability, you usually run a thermal ramp. Thermal ramps are quick, about 2 hours, give you a lot of information about the melting and the aggregation behavior of the protein, and allow you to narrow the list of candidates down so you have fewer candidates to focus your subsequent work on. However, long-term exposure is also something you want to keep in mind, because I'm sure you've all been there. I certainly have. Living in the Bay Area with the proverbial fog, you walk out in the morning, oh, it's not going to be sunny today. I'm not going to get burned. I don't need sunscreen. And then in the evening, everything is red. Long-term exposure is something to work with, something to think about, something to be aware of. And sunscreen helps. And in the same vein, looking at the isothermal stability of a protein can help you prevent bad surprises later on in the development process. When we are talking about isothermal stability of proteins, what we want to look at really is we keep our proteins at a steady temperature over a long period of time, and we monitor their behavior, their unfolding behavior, and their aggregation behavior. And that's things that you can do with the new isothermal applications in UNCLE. Why is this important? Well, what people oftentimes do in developing a protein candidate further is they do a thermal ramp first to narrow down the number of candidates, and then they do the isothermal testing at the very end of the development process. That's because isothermal, as it is oftentimes done, is pretty cumbersome. You have to have a large amount of protein solution. You have to store it. You have to run it, for example, in HPLC to look at aggregation and loss due to aggregation. And all these things make isothermal testing, make long-term storage testing kind of cumbersome. Even accelerated stability testing is not really that super fast. It still takes a considerable amount of time and also of volume. When using the new isothermal applications in UNCLE, we open a door to testing both thermal ramping behavior and isothermal long-term behavior at the same stage of the candidate selection process, so early on. It is so easy to run isothermal in UNCLE. You can run between 1 and 48 samples at a time so that you can use both thermal ramping experiments and isothermal long-term storage experiments to narrow down your list of candidates. And I think that's really the power of it, that you get access to this very important metric of your protein early on. And what I will talk about in this presentation, I'll give you 2 case studies where we looked at 2 proteins and compare results we have from thermal ramps with results we have from longer-term isothermal exposures. Before talking about that, let me first briefly review what we mean when we talk about protein stability. Proteins, of course, we all know they have a native structure, they have a native fold, and that's in an equilibrium with the unfolded state. So by increasing the temperature, you can push this equilibrium towards the unfolded state. This is what we refer to as conformational stability of a protein. To make things more complicated, proteins also do other things. They can also aggregate, something that we call the colloidal stability. And both the native state can aggregate and the unfolded state can aggregate. So in order to monitor the behavior of protein, to monitor protein stability over time or over temperature, we want to keep both the conformational and the colloidal stability in mind. We want to keep an eye on both of these. And the right tool for the job to do this is UNCLE. UNCLE combines 3 different measurement modalities in one instrument. So we can measure fluorescence, we can measure static light scattering, and we can measure dynamic light scattering in a temperature-controlled environment. In terms of the fluorescence, we use 2 different laser systems to excite fluorescence. We use a UV laser of 266 nanometers, and we use a blue laser of 473. That way, we can excite both the protein intrinsic fluorescence with the UV laser and potential dyes that you want to use. That's what the blue laser is for. At the same time as exciting with 2 laser systems, we monitor the full spectrum of fluorescence emission of the analyte. So we are very flexible in looking at the protein in the shorter wavelengths or reporter dyes like SYPRO orange in the longer wavelengths. In the 2 case studies I'll show later, we'll cover both of these topics as well. The signals that, or the light that is scattered from those two lasers is what we use in our SLS experiment. Static light scattering is a readout of molar mass. As a protein aggregates, the molar mass increases. So the SLS signal is something we can use to assess protein aggregation over time or over a temperature gradient. We have that SLS data for both of our lasers, so both the UV laser and the blue laser. That gives us very high sensitivity of detection of aggregation, and at the same time gives us a big dynamic range so we can cover orders of magnitude of aggregation occurring. UNCLE also packs dynamic light scattering. It sounds almost like static light scattering, but is fundamentally different. Here in this case, we look at the diffusive behavior of our analyte, and that is an orthogonal measure of aggregation that can apply. Temperature control, UNCLE can be set in temperature between 15 degrees Celsius and 95 degrees, and we can do that for a ramp, but we can also, of course, do this for isothermal experiments and keep the temperature steady over longer periods of time. The heart of UNCLE, the sample introduction into UNCLE, happens in the unis. The unis are arrays of 16 quartz cuvettes in an anodized aluminum frame. That anodized aluminum is there to make sure that the temperature conductance is high, so the temperature of the sample is what you've actually said. And these cuvettes have a volume of 9 microliters. They're open on both ends, fairly easy to load. Capillary force sucks the sample right in. And then these unis are clamped in the blue uni frame with silicone seals. So these silicone seals are consumables, and they seal off the quartz cuvette, and you don't have to worry about evaporation. The 9 microliters of your sample are safely sealed in the uni, and then you can use that in a temperature ramp or also in your isothermal experiment. When you run a protein in a thermal ramp, so in this case here you see individual spectra building up. We have one spectrum recorded for every degree in our temperature ramp from 15 to 95, so 80 spectra here in this case. And what we're seeing as this temperature increases is that the protein unfolds. And you see that the fluorescence spectrum changes. The maximum, first of all, gets lower, and it shifts to the right. It shifts to longer wavelengths for this protein. That is because the aromatic amino acid residues that are responsible for the autofluorescence of the protein, the phenylalanines, tyrosines, tryptophans, are usually buried on the inside of the protein in a hydrophobic environment, and they show fluorescence. As the protein melts and they are turned outside to the hydrophilic environment that the protein is in, their fluorescence behavior changes. And when we monitor the fluorescence in the temperature gradient, we can assess unfolding that way. This shows also the full spectrum of fluorescence of UNCLE. So we record from 250 to 720 nanometers. I cut this off a little bit here because it's just the baseline, but you can look at the protein intrinsic fluorescence here in the blue section. If you had a dye in here, you would see that over here. And I have an example for that coming up later. This is the raw data that UNCLE delivers, so the spectra. And then we process that data to a graph that looks something like this. We have our fluorescence here on the left y-axis. The x-axis is the temperature. This is a temperature ramp experiment. And we have our static light scattering in green on our right y-axis here in this case. What we're showing for fluorescence is what we call the BCM, the barycentric mean. That is the spectral center of gravity of our fluorescence emission. It is the wavelength that separates the area under the curve in two equal halves. With this kind of analysis, we integrate over the entire peak of the fluorescence emission, so about 130 wavelengths, which gives us a really high signal to noise ratio and calm signal. So if we follow this, we can see how as the fluorescence emission maximum shifts in wavelengths, we see that represented here in the curve. And then there are two inflection points in this curve, which the software determines by looking at the differential. Those would be two melting points, Tm1 and Tm2 of our analyte. That is what we want to find out in our temperature ramp. At the same time as looking at the unfolding behavior, we also get a glance on the colloidal stability because the static light scattering signal is rather boring, it's rather flat, and that at around 80 degrees that starts spiking because that's when the sample starts aggregating. This aggregation for this specific sample here happens in concert with the Tm2 with the second melting event. So much the introduction, so much as to the theory of what we find out in a temperature ramp. Let's take a look at the first case study. In this case, we have a monoclonal antibody, commercially available monoclonal antibody in 3 different formulations. We have the no salt condition in green. We have low salt, 50 millimolar sodium chloride in blue, and we have high salt, 250 millimolar sodium chloride in yellow. Otherwise, the buffer system is a 25 millimolar histidine buffer of pH 7.4. So when we look at these three formulations that are varying only in their salt content, and we look at the melting behavior, these three formulations show pretty much comparable, similar melting behavior. So it's varying, melting points vary between 69.5 and 70.4 degrees Celsius, so about 1 degree difference. The high salt condition in yellow seems to be slightly less stable than the low salt and the low salt condition. When we look at the aggregation behavior, and I forgot to mention this earlier, but we measure these two parameters at the same time in the same volume. So the sample is in the uni, and we record static light scattering and fluorescence concomitantly, same time, same sample, same temperature point in this gradient. Looking at the aggregation behavior, we can see that the low salt in blue, let me put the arrows in for the actual aggregation points. So the low salt condition, 50 millimolar salt, starts aggregating first, and the no salt and high salt conditions, they start aggregating a little bit later. These two aggregation points are about 1 degree different. This one is 66 degrees, so this is about 7 degrees lower. So there's significant destabilization in terms of aggregation of our sample in the low salt condition. But differentiating between the no salt and the high salt is going to be difficult. That's what we can learn from the temperature gradient. As I was mentioning earlier, we also measure DLS. So let's take a look at what that shows. And our DLS experiment actually confirms that the sample aggregates in our thermal ramp. When we look at the DLS spectra that were recorded, or the DLS signal, I should say, that's not a spectrum, at 15 degrees, we see that the monoclonal antibody shows a typical diameter of about 10, 11 nanometers. And then as we have ramped the temperature up to 95, you can see that these diameters have increased to more than a micrometer. So DLS confirms that our sample has aggregated and confirms what we saw from the static light scattering signal. Now, what can we learn about our monoclonal antibody in an isothermal experiment? So in this case, we have our monoclonal antibody, we incubate it at a given temperature over long periods of time, and we see how our fluorescence and our static light scattering signal will change. We can also look at the dynamic light scattering signal, of course. Example data, so this is not quite a case study yet, I'll get to that in a second, but let's look at some example data here. We also see that if we look at the fluorescence in blue on the left y-axis, that the BCM value shifts, and this is an isothermal experiment over 24 hours at 58 degrees. And at the same time as the fluorescence signal is monitored and changes, we also monitor at the same time as the fluorescence signal is monitored and changes, the static light scattering signal is also monitored and changes, indicating that the sample is aggregating. So again, in UNCLE, we measure fluorescence and static light scattering at the same time and can deduce what our sample does in this isothermal experiment. This experiment was run at 58 degrees Celsius. And I think one of the most important questions when running an isothermal experiment is, how do you want to design it? How do you choose which temperature you incubate in? Some people like using melting temperature -5 degrees. Other people use 42 degrees, 47, 60 degrees. Because they have an incubator set at that temperature. It's really quite flexible, and there is not really any consensus on how you would want to do it. So for our experiment, what we did is we looked at our melting and aggregation temperatures and then chose 60 degrees as a temperature for our isothermal. That's about 10 degrees lower than the melting temperatures, and it's about 6 to 8 degrees lower than what we saw for aggregation. What I think is really one of the strengths in UNCLE is that these isothermal experiments are so easy. So you could actually run several of them, one day at 60 degrees, next day at 65, next day at 55, and really find out what the ideal temperature for your isothermal, longer term isothermal is. So you do like a scouting experiment. In our case, we chose 60 degrees and we actually did see something. So let me show what we found. So looking at the static light scattering intensity from a monoclonal antibody, and this is one at 266, so using the UV laser, we see that the low salt condition in blue here, 50 millimolar salt, starts aggregating first, and the high salt condition and the no salt condition start aggregating later. So until about 3 hours, they behave similarly, and then we really see a difference between the two conditions. So by running a 6-hour isothermal experiment at 60 degrees, we can really show that although the aggregation temperatures between yellow and green, between high salt and no salt, are only different by 1 degree Celsius, the aggregation behavior in the isothermal experiment over 6 hours really shows us which the most stable formulation is. As I was mentioning, we are not only measuring the static light scattering at 266 nanometers, we're also measuring at 473 nanometers, and that result confirms what we saw for the short wavelengths. Also here, the aggregation of the low salt condition, 50 millimolar salt in blue, is occurring first, and the most stable one is the no salt condition here in green. The new isothermal applications in UNCLE also allow you to determine rate constants. I'm showing this down here. So for the blue condition, the low salt condition that shows the highest aggregation, the K1, the rate constant, is the lowest value. So we also, in addition to looking at the graphs by eye, we also have a mathematical metric for the aggregation in the form of the rate constants. Isothermal experiments like this can take a lot of time. So in this case, it only took 6 hours, but you can in principle devise an isothermal that takes several days, takes up to a week, and that kind of sort of locks in your instrument for the duration of that experiment. But because isothermal testing takes time, and because we know that our samples are safely sealed in the uni, we thought it might be really nice to have another set of applications in UNCLE that we termed the out-of-the-box apps. As the name suggests, you incubate outside of UNCLE. You take your sample, read the signal, dynamic light scattering, static light scattering, fluorescence. You take the uni out, put it in an external incubator, incubate it there as long as you like, put it back into UNCLE and add another data point. So the file, the results file, is not locked. You can add, you can append data points and evaluate, analyze that data together, and when you have all the data points in that you would like to have. And also, you're not tied in terms of the temperature, the timestamps. You can choose how many hours you want in between the individual reads. What does this look like in practice? So here is an example of our monoclonal antibody. We measured static light scattering at 473 nanometers, so aggregation behavior at time point 0, at 20 hours, 40 hours, 60 hours. And again, we can clearly see that the low salt condition in blue 50 millimolar salt shows aggregation that starts sometime after the 20-hour time point. And we can grab that, we can measure that with our out-of-the-box experiment. For the 20 hours between those reads, UNCLE is free for other things. So you can start an out-of-the-box experiment for isothermal, take your sample out, put it in an incubator, and then use UNCLE for the time being for other experiments like a KD run, a B22 measurement, or a thermal ramp for other researchers or other projects. So it gives you a lot of flexibility in how you use your instrument. We can do this OTB out-of-the-box experiment not only for static light scattering, we can also do this for dynamic light scattering. So here included DLS in this daily snapshot, time point 0, time point 20 hours, time point 40 hours. And we have one light blue sample here kept at 4 degrees, and you can see the 12 nanometer diameter of that IgG remains constant in the fridge, but at 60 degrees, we see clear increase. So this out-of-the-box experiment gives you a good way of following the aggregation of your sample. For our monoclonal antibody, here's a summary. All the aggregation metrics agree. So if we look at the aggregation from temperature ramp versus the ones from the isothermal experiments and the OTB out of the box, we can see that the low salt condition really is the worst in terms of aggregation. And if you had to choose one, it's probably the 25 millimolar histidine at pH 7.4 without salt is going to be the best one that you can look at. That concludes the first case study. Let's take a second case study into account here, and that used Rnase A. Rnase A is a small protein, about 17 kilodaltons, and is very low in aromatic residues. So if we look at the fluorescence, here is the monoclonal antibody we just had with the fluorescence after 266 nanometer excitation. And here's the Rnase A. You see it's a much lower fluorescent yield. And if you looked at the BCM curve for Rnase A, it'd be pretty flat. It doesn't show much change because there is just very few aromatic residues in here that would be usable in intrinsic protein fluorescence. What you do in this case? Well, we can use a reporter dye. So we used SYPRO orange in this case. SYPRO orange is a dye that interacts with hydrophobic protein patches. So as the protein unfolds, these hydrophobic patches are presented. SYPRO interacts with those and increases its fluorescence. So as you see that here on the On the right side, if my pointer moves with me, we have the folded protein where SYPRO orange has nothing to interact with, so there's very low fluorescence yield. But as the protein unfolds, or is unfolded, I should say, we see a much higher fluorescence yield from the SYPRO interacting with the hydrophobic patches of the protein. So when we look at thermal ramp experiment using Rnase A and SYPRO orange, this is what we see with our 3 formulations, the same formulations as before. We see no difference in the melting behavior between those 3 formulations, and we also don't see any aggregation happen. So in terms of Rnase A, there's really no way we can judge which of these formulations is better and which one is the one we want to use for further optimization studies. So what we did is we also took this analyte here in an isothermal experiment. And what we actually see here is we see aggregation that starts around after 10, 11 hours. In the no salt condition in green and in the low salt in blue, we can see clear aggregation occurring. This is looking at the 266 nanometer light scattering intensity, whereas in high salt, it remains flat. So no aggregation in high salt, aggregation in no salt and in low salt. So in this case, we need the isothermal experiment to really be able to differentiate between the different formulations. We also, of course, wanted to try the new out-of-the-box app for this analyte. So this is the static light scattering. We look at the Z average diameter over 3 days, measured once a day. And you can see that in the high salt, confirms what we saw from static light scattering. In high salt, it remains flat, whereas in low salt and no salt, here in green and blue, we see significant aggregation that is already visible almost after the first day. Again, in OTB experiments, out-of-the-box experiments, you are flexible in staggering your data points whatever way you want. The files themselves are time-stamped, so the instrument or the software will keep track of the time elapsed. But for these 24 hours between those reads, you can use your instrument for other purposes. So summarizing the second case study of Rnase A, only the isothermal experiment is able to rank the different conditions. The ramp rate doesn't give, the ramp doesn't give us any difference. It looks good in all cases, but looking at it isothermally, we can really differentiate between the formulations and see that only the 250 millimolar salt condition is really good and something that we want to look into further for further refinement of our formulation. So to summarize this, UNCLE, the first all-in-one stability platform, has a set of tailor-made isothermal stability tools, both the regular isothermal tools and the out-of-the-box tools that allow you to start using long-term stability testing early on in your candidate selection process. We, of course, retain what we had before, the Tm and Tagg applications. We can still run DSF applications. We can also take a look at viral capsid stability. And we also actually have an isothermal application that is specifically coined towards the viral vectors. Not the topic of this webinar, but we'll talk about this in the future. You can also still use UNCLE's DLS for a DLS with polydispersity analysis or combine it with a thermal ramp. You can look at colloidal stability parameters like KD, B22, the second viral coefficient, or G22. You can use UNCLE to look at thermal recovery, viscosity, and also at isothermal chemical denaturation experiments. So with all this, UNCLE is really your lifeguard at the beach. It'll watch over your 48 samples for 2 hours. It'll also look over them for a day or 2 days and tell you when it's time to put on sunscreen. UNCLE is your all-in-one protein stability platform. Makes sure that all of your analytes behave the way, or you know how your analytes will behave. And with that, I'm going to be happy to answer any questions that have come on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mueller. Yes, we do have a few questions that have come in. Our first one is from Caroline, and this came earlier before you mentioned this SYPRO orange, but she asked, were the results you were showing with or without SYPRO orange?
Thank you very much for this question. I saw it coming in, so I am assuming it was based on the monoclonal antibody work, and that one was done focusing solely on the protein intrinsic fluorescence. So if the protein has plenty of fluorescence by itself, then that's our preferred way of analyzing it. Only if there is a condition where there is no protein intrinsic fluorescence, then we would resort to the extrinsic fluorescence. Or, for example, if you have an older protocol that you want to carry over, use SYPRO orange. but the monoclonal antibody work in the first half, in the first case study, that was done without any SYPRO orange present.
All right, thank you. And a follow-up question, this one from Brad. When would you use a reporter dye?
Yeah, so as just mentioned, thanks, it really matches in well here. If you have a condition where protein fluorescence is non-existent, protein intrinsic fluorescence, so if the protein is low in aromatic residues, or if you have a buffer condition that quenches the protein's own fluorescence, if there's, for example, ATP present, or if there's ascorbic acid, in that case, you would want to go and use a reporter dye. Also, if you have, as I mentioned just now, if you have an older protocol and you want to follow that legacy protocol that required you to do DSF or thermofluor experiment, then you could use the fluorescent dye. The nice thing with UNCLE is that you are really flexible. It allows you to use either method, both methods. You can compare both methods because you are recording full spectrum fluorescence and you're exciting fluorescence both in the protein intrinsic wavelength range with a UV laser, and then you can use dyes using the blue laser as excitation.
Okay. The next question, sort of a more general question, are there any other changes that were introduced in the new software?
Yes, of course, if we do a software project and bring out a new version, this is version 6.0, there is other improvements as well. So what we did is in addition to adding 5 new isothermal applications, so we have 3 isothermal, we have 2 out-of-the-box applications, tailor-made to the different systems you want to use. So one isothermal application that is specifically for a dye, one that is for viral vectors. Also, the OTBs are more general or coined towards using a dye. So in addition to those 5 new applications, we have given the software a facelift. So, for example, the sample color assignment is different. We have made the DLS display a little bit more tight, and it shows you more directly what you need to focus on, what you want to focus on. And then also replicate groups have been introduced. So if you run a sample in triplicate, you can display the 3 individual measurements, but the software also averages them for you and displays them together with a standard deviation. So we always listen to what our customers like as improvements, and I think we have been able to pack a lot of improvements, large and small, into this new software version. So I personally don't like to go back to 5.04 to use it. I like 6 a lot better because it feels a lot nicer, and I think that everybody who has used the older softwares will agree that this is a nice new software to use.
Perfect. A question from Jennifer. Can you discuss the details of sample volume and consumable? Is it 9 microliter volumes, and are the quartz cuvettes reusable, or do they need to be cleaned, and how hard is that?
Thank you for that question. So the sample volume is 9 microliters. That is correct. So the quartz cuvette in the uni, in the anodized aluminum frame, has a volume of 9 microliters. You then close the blue frame around it with the silicon gaskets that seals the samples off. So 9 microliters is the loading volume. These unis are consumables, so you use them once. I mean, think about it another way. You have a quartz cuvette in which you denature a protein. So there is going to be protein depositions on the inside of that cuvette, and they're not designed to be cleaned and reused. So you use the quartz cuvettes, the unis themselves, and the silicon gaskets once, and then for a new sample, you use a new one. Of course, there are 16 cuvettes in a uni, so if you were running only 4 today, you can use the other 12 tomorrow. That is not a problem, but a single quartz cuvette is a single-use item.
All right. Our next question, how flexible are the new isothermal apps in UNCLE?
Thanks for that one. As I mentioned, there are 5 isothermal apps, and I'm grouping the out-of-the-box apps together with the regular isothermal. So we have one isothermal that gives you full flexibility of using either of the 2 lasers for SLS and fluorescence, and also the DLS system. Then we have an isothermal application that is using only the blue laser. That would be something for dyes. We call that isothermal stability with SYPRO. And then we also have an isothermal capsid stability that would be used for the viral vector applications, where we would use a dye like CyberGold. This is something that I haven't talked about now, but this is something that we will tackle in an upcoming webinar in the future. So these applications are flexible in Because there is a number of different applications, so that gives you flexibility in and of itself. And then within the application, the choice of fluorescence, static light scattering, dynamic light scattering, that's all up to you. So I think all in all, whatever you know from UNCLE as a very flexible tool to tackle your experimental questions, the isothermal apps live up to that standard and allow you to remain flexible in your work.
All right, perfect. Brent asks, can we use isothermal apps to study AAV and other viral vectors?
Yes, absolutely. Again, this was, couldn't pack too much in one webinar, so this one was focusing more on the biologics, more on the proteins, but viral vectors also. So if you know how UNCLE software is set up, we can use UNCLE to characterize the genome ejection from a viral vector in addition to looking at the stability of the viral capsid proteins themselves. And we have this isothermal capsid stability application that is basically the sibling to the viral vector ramp application. So yes, we have a dedicated tailor-made application for isothermal characterization of viral vectors.
All right. This question a bit more specific from Braylon. Does UNCLE have tools for 21 CFR Part 11 compliance?
It does, yes. We can both provide installation and operational qualification of the instrument itself, and then there is a mode to the software that uses an audit trail and is ready to be used in a 21 CFR Part 11 compliant environment. So the tools for that are part of both the hardware and also the UNCLE software.
All right. One more question for you. Can you use a uni for several tests?
Thanks for that one. Yeah, as I was saying earlier in response to Jennifer's question, the uni in itself is a single-use item, but that is on a per cuvette basis. So if you, of the 16, if you use some today and some tomorrow, that is fine, but the uni itself, the cuvette itself is designed for single use. However, this is a kind of a flexible question to ask, is it several data points? Because in an experiment where you record DLS, SLS, and fluorescence, you get several data points out of it. So yes, the uni can be used for several data points, but one quartz cuvette is as a single-use item.
All right, thank you so much. That appears to be the last question that we've received. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you very much, Dr. Andre Mueller, for presenting today, and to thank the folks at Unchained Labs for sponsoring today. With that, I'd like to especially thank those of you who came and spent this time with us. We're very grateful you came, and we hope we were able to provide information that will make life in the lab a bit easier. So on behalf of Cambridge Innovation Institute, thank you all so very much, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.